If you're having a hard time building momentum in your powerlifting or general strength training, this is the video for you. Today, we're going to provide a framework to ensure you're simultaneously pushing your limits to promote adaptations while also managing fatigue. What's going on? My name is Josh Pelland. I'm a strength coach and exercise scientist. I'm also a co-owner here at Data Driven Strength. And if you're new here, we help lifters maximize strength and hypertrophy by integrating research into practice. Now with that, let's jump right into our framework for balancing hard training with fatigue management, starting with differentiating between what's called primary days and secondary days. As the name suggests, a primary day is the highest priority day for a given lift. I generally like to separate primary days for my clients throughout the week, so primary squat, bench press, and deadlift are on different days. However, this is subject to individualization and lifter preference. Now, the biggest thing to note is that the training week is designed to have the strongest performance of the week for the lift on that primary day. This requires some trial and error, but as a basic example, our Infinity Programs system, which is a lower cost programming option that we offer, uses an individualization quiz that directly asks if the lifter seems to perform better with their primary days earlier versus later in the week. Now, once you have your primary day for a given lift identified, the key characteristic of it from a programming perspective is that it is the day with the highest loads or the highest percentage of your 1 rep max. This is generally going to be through one or multiple top sets of 1 to 5 reps at a relatively high RPE. Deciding exactly how heavy to make the top set on a primary day could be a whole video itself, but I generally like to vary this by starting around 4 or 5 reps when far away from a competition or a test day, and then progressing that towards singles. However, there are massive individual differences here. For example, some of my clients do 4, sometimes even 5 singles per week on bench press, and some of them will even do it almost year round, whereas others may only do singles on bench press within a few weeks of a competition or test day. Now, physiologically, it makes sense to bias heavier loads given the strong relationship we see in the research between heavier loads and strength gains. However, most studies are relatively short term, around 10 weeks or so on average, and thus do not account for the sustainability that is required for maximizing long-term progression. So in practice, when making these calls on the individual level, the main consideration is tolerance. If low rep, high load training is difficult to recover from for a given individual, such as by causing an ache or a pain to flare up, it's often smart to just pull back as needed to ensure quality training can be accumulated over time. Then, after the heaviest work on the primary day, there are a lot of possibilities from there. However, after 1 or multiple top sets and then 1 or multiple back off sets on the main lift, I often find myself also programming the most difficult hypertrophy work of the week to grow the prime movers of the lift, such as say 2 to 5 sets of Romanian deadlift close to failure. The reason I like to program this difficult hypertrophy work on the primary day is because a well-executed hypertrophy movement that takes the target muscles to a long length and close to failure, as the evidence suggests is necessary to maximize hypertrophy, that's going to be quite fatiguing. So doing this right after the heaviest work of the week gives you the most time to recover before circling back to your primary day in the following week. So to summarize, the main goal of primary days is high quality practice with heavy loads on the main lift. And again, these days are often also what I like to call polarized because we like to also have hard hypertrophy training on these days. Now, there can only be one primary day for each lift, and we'll often have more than 1 day per week training each lift or a close variation of it, such as a pause squat for your main low bar squat, for example. So that's where secondary days come in. And just to be clear, I'll use the term secondary for any day that isn't a primary day. So you can have multiple secondary days for a given lift using the terminology that I'll use for the rest of the video. Now, how you go about programming secondary days are where things get interesting and can really make or break your strength momentum. So on one hand, secondary days are vital for strength progress because the research indicates that more than one session per week can be beneficial as it allows for more quality training within the week as a whole. And also, just anecdotally, a methodical increase in frequency can often break strength plateaus for a good amount of lifters. On the other hand, given we want to ensure high performance on the primary day, we also want to avoid causing very high fatigue that we can't recover from by the time we get to our next primary day. As you can probably guess, the cost-benefit analysis here is going to largely be determined on an individual level. Some lifters can have one or multiple very challenging secondary days and still recover for the primary day. Other lifters may need to be much more conservative. Another factor that determines the cost-benefit analysis when programming these secondary days is the proximity to a competition or a test day. And this is where periodization comes in, which is simply the strategic manipulation of training variables over time. And when you're far out from a competition or a test day, it may be worth it to compromise some recovery going into the primary day to ensure you also get a really good hypertrophy stimulus on that secondary day. So for example, when far out from a competition or a test day, the secondary day may be a couple easier sets of high bar squat followed by a hypertrophy slot, such as a quad biased split squat to grow the prime mover in the squat. Then you can take that same day and think about how that might change when approaching a competition or a test day. And in this case, as you get closer to that test day, the performance on the primary day becomes more and more important. So we may want to drop the secondary day hypertrophy slot to spare some fatigue. Another reason we can get away with dropping the secondary day hypertrophy slot is because when we get close to a competition or a test day, hypertrophy work is going to have less of a direct effect on your strength progress. Additionally, there's some evidence to suggest that performing a lower fatigue day of the main lift, or we can probably extrapolate this out to a close variation as well, if we do that lower fatigue a couple of days before the primary day, that can lead to greater strength gains compared to doing a higher fatigue type of protocol a couple days before that primary day. And ultimately, this is likely because it increases the peak loads you're able to lift on the primary day, which again seems to be one of the strongest predictors of short to moderate term strength gains. So if you're struggling to build momentum with your powerlifting or general strength training, take a good look at how your secondary days are currently being programmed. A lot of the time, you'll want them to also provide a solid hypertrophy stimulus. But if they're taking away from your ability to train with high peak loads, especially when close to competition or a testing day, it may be worth making those days easier to allow performance on the primary day to emerge.